I've lost count the number of times I've got asked this question. And I got it a lot, especially after I shared that I had untethered from Christianity. And let me be clear, that just means I am no longer a Christian. But most people asking the question aren't as nice as Anne here. Instead, they demand that I stop using the title of Reverend, or they mock me or say I'm a fake or a witch or a heretic, just any of those things. And part of me wants to be pithy in my response because I'm kind of good at it, because I've earned it, because it bothers you so much that I still carry the title, or because you have no problem calling a man who never went to seminary and only got the job as pastor because he was related to the head pastor, or he was voted in by a bunch of men in a secret meeting after church one Sunday. And if that's how you qualify a reverend, then I can keep my title as reverend. Or something like that. And sometimes I'd like to answer that way, but I do think there's a conversation here that we can have about why I still call myself a reverend, because it's still meaningful for me, and it's something in my life that I'm not willing to debate. It holds the story of deconstructing from a religion that once was so dear to me. So dear that I tattooed the words, "the least of these," on my forearm with a cross. Hold on, I'll show you. Can you see it? I don't know. It's there. It's inside the logo of an animal welfare organization that I founded. It's all part of my story. And I have never considered removing that tattoo because it's a part of who I am. And it reminds me of who I once was, but am no longer. But when I sat down to write about why I'm still a reverend, even though I'm no longer a Christian, I started to reflect on this journey from an obedient Southern Baptist to an ordained interfaith, interspiritual minister. And in between those bookends are the story that's still being written, a story that will likely resonate with some of you, because some of you have done as I did. You deconstructed right out of those church doors, perhaps like me forever, and perhaps like me no longer Christian. But hearing my story may help you understand the importance of respect in how people show up in the world, especially around their spirituality. I hope that's what this video does for you, is to help, like millions of us, navigating some stage of deconstructing. I started searching for a seminary, and I'll try to make this part as short as possible, but you know me, I can't tell a story very short. Anyway, at the time I left church, I was in the ministry program that was run by that church, but that was nothing more than a pipeline to groom volunteers into a lifetime of non-paid commitment to the church. And I was about 8 weeks into that program when I walked out of church. And in some ways, that program did me a favor, because I got to see so deeply into the cult-like programming this church was willing to go in order to make compliant foot soldiers for their church. And some dots finally connected for me. But leaving church didn't satisfy this desire I had to still go somewhere and study ministry. So after a few years of studying world religions and biblical studies, I began to research seminaries. At the time, I still considered myself a Christian, and hopefully I would be called to find a church. I simply recoiled at seminaries that said things like, "We believe the Bible is an inerrant and infallible word of God." Any of that language in the About Us section, I wanted nothing to do with. And if I had been more in touch with what was happening to me, I would have perhaps seen farther down the path that would ultimately lead to my leaving church forever and then untethering completely from Christianity. There is truth in what they say about the teacher arriving when the student was ready, and at that time I simply wasn't ready. I had even spent time on, get this, Liberty University's website, and I knew that I was going to have to lie if I was going to have to sign some kind of statement of faith. But then I began to research what it meant to be an interfaith, interspiritual minister, and I found One Spirit Interfaith Seminary. And I don't know any other way to say this other than reading that website, it felt like coming home. Also talked to people who criticized the fact that that seminary is not accredited. I was not looking for that type of seminary in the first place. And I've been on both sides of this. I have seen some really good pastors who have never gone to seminary. And I have seen people with masters of divinities and doctorate degrees be absolutely ineffective, misogynist pigs in places of authority that they did not belong. And I was bringing all of this into my experience of looking for a seminary. And yes, even now, it is common to be attacked by those who never went to seminary, but their self-righteousness and piety make them believe that they have a right to judge me. And I'll also hear from those with masters of divinity. because I'm here to tell you that Christian patriarchy is in all branches of Christianity. That's all I'm going to say about this right now. Let's keep going. So the first day of seminary arrives, and this is in New York City, so I'm going there, I'm walking into the elevator, and everything in me is screaming, just go back to your hotel room, pack up, fly home. This is insane. You should not be here. This is a sin. But as I stepped into the elevator, there was a note taped to the wall addressed to the first year seminary students. And someone must have known that many students are looking for something beyond their Christian understanding and indoctrination. But looking beyond, however, comes with a lot of guilt. That somehow we are failing at being the good Christian that's still inside us, that indoctrination is still inside us, or that we felt our souls were in peril if we walked through those doors and into that first class. So that note did encourage me to take a breath, trust that we were there where we needed to be, and to join them, what ended up being a journey of a lifetime. Turns out I was not the only one who hesitated before entering that classroom, and I also was not the only one who hadn't fully disclosed to family members and friends what type of seminary One Spirit was. When people ask me what I was up to, I just say, I'm going to seminary, and I'd let that be a complete sentence. And if people ask me how things were going, I just say, fine, because my deeply religious family wouldn't understand. And to be honest, I wasn't even sure what the future held for me once I was ordained. Those 2 years in seminary, they flew by, but it changed me and healed me in ways that I didn't know was possible. I had assumed that Interfaith seminary was learning about world religions and spiritual traditions, and we did. There was a lot of information about that, but the website said things like we would be inspired and changed and motivated to be a part of the healing in the world. And that sounded nice when I read it, but without the context, it wasn't the primary reason for my picking One Spirit. I was desperate to know who God was outside of my Christian heritage. I knew something else existed beyond my understanding, and One Spirit gave me hope of finding it. It did help me find it, but I quickly learned that being inspired, changed, and motivated to be a part of the healing in the world was going to also transform me in ways I hadn't known was possible. I was several months in when I came to accept that I'm going to cry every time I had a session with my dean, but little by little, we kept trying to help me answer the question, why was I here? Not just in seminary, but in this moment and here in my life. And when you're answering that type of question, you have no choice but to show up in a vulnerability that I had never shown before. I had learned a long time ago that being vulnerable was a good way to be taken advantage of. But One Spirit restored my hope in humanity. It did not give me a roadmap to discover who I would be after ordination, but it did give me the courage and wisdom to figure it out for myself. So then when the time for ordination came, we knew we were going to be given the title of Reverend, but that was the very thing that my denominational heritage said a woman could never be. But also no human should be called a Reverend because it is a title that only Jesus should hold. So there was another wave of hesitation and resistance, not just from me, but others like me, who had been raised to believe that women were not qualified to be ministers and Jesus alone was to be called the Reverend. But once again, the staff was ready to meet us where we were and invited us to see what it meant to live with reverence and to strive to be reverent in all we did. Being reverent means showing up with a deep, profound respect or awe for something or someone. It goes beyond ordinary politeness, often bordering on adoration or solemn veneration. And we all came to see how indoctrinations into aspects of our religious heritage had created limiting beliefs about our self-worth and the value we bring to spiritual leadership. The word reverend itself speaks to reverence, and that is deeply meaningful to me now in a way it perhaps never was before. I no longer define reverence to patriarchal theology or institutional religion. Reverence for me means honoring the sacredness of human life. It means sitting with grief honestly. It means protecting vulnerable people. It means advocating for those harmed by systems of power. It means approaching life, humanity, the earth, and even suffering with compassion, humility, and care. And reverence is not something that religion owns. It is something human beings are capable of embodying in many different ways. So, Reverend it was, and Reverend Carla I would be. Rev Carla for short. But that so isn't where the story ends. So seminary provided me with connection, validation, and meaning, and I was no longer hiding my ordination as an interfaith, interspiritual minister. I was proud of it. I still am very proud of it, and I left seminary content that I had indeed made the right decision. I had also come to accept that many of the questions I thought would be answered in seminary, they may never be answered. But my journey to seek those answers would become my spiritual path. And had I known the label of deconstructing at the time, I would have called it that. But it would be years before I heard that word that has now become synonymous with untangling from a system of belief that caused harm to you or to others. I've shared so much of my deconstructing journey on social media for well over a decade, as well as in my book, Deconstructing. And there have been some who have followed me since those early years and witnessed my struggle with hanging on to my Christian heritage in some meaningful and sacred way. I don't recognize myself in some of my earlier writings, but I defended my right to be unchurched and Christian, spiritual but not religious and Christian, questioning and Christian, and of course, an interfaith, interspiritual minister and Christian. But along the way, I often encountered criticism that was often cruel from Christians who demanded that I adhere to what they believed was the only way to be Christian, and I intended to prove them wrong. But I did think about this a lot, and one Sunday, I was sitting out on my porch and I was thinking about this when I came upon a sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King. He delivered this sermon in 1954. The title of the sermon was Transformed Nonconformist. And reading Dr. King's words reminded me that there has always been tension between institutional religion and people who feel spiritually compelled towards justice, advocacy, and moral courage. Things that were vital to how I viewed spirituality versus a hyper-focus on salvation. And although Dr. King was speaking to Christians in 1954, the heart of what he was saying still resonates deeply now. He was saying that faith should not make people passive, silent, or obedient to harmful systems. So he was speaking to me from 1954, and he was offering me a historical and spiritual bridge that affirmed my desire to reject the demand of those saying a good Christian is an obedient Christian. And one of the most powerful parts of the sermon is King's warning about conformity. He describes how easily human beings surrender themselves to the mass mind, how institutions, including churches, become more interested in preserving comfort and majority approval than standing for what is right. And that insight feels painfully relevant today because Dr. King openly criticized the church for conforming to slavery, segregation, exploitation, and war rather than challenging those systems. He was literally naming the danger of spiritual complacency long before many people were willing to hear it. I felt his words deeply because so much of my own deconstructing came from recognizing the same patterns inside modern Christianity. And that's the fear of standing apart, the fear of challenging power, the fear of losing the belonging. And Dr. King's metaphor about the thermometer and the thermostat inside that sermon especially feels important now. He said the Christian should not merely reflect the temperature of society like a thermometer, but should transform it like a thermostat. That language helped me understand that spirituality at its best should move people towards courage, compassion, justice, and transformation. It should not simply mirror the dominant culture or baptize systems of harm. Advocacy became part of my spiritual life because I could no longer separate sacredness from the responsibility to speak honestly about suffering, oppression, Christian patriarchy, religious harm, and injustice. I also think that Dr. King's life itself becomes part of this reflection, because people often remember him now as universally admired, but during his lifetime he was deeply criticized, resisted, surveilled, and condemned, including by many white churches and moderate Christians who preferred comfort over advocacy. His eventual formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference reflected the reality that institutional Christianity was often unwilling to move with the urgency justice required. I think of the sharp contrast of Dr. King's work within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference because the Southern Baptist Convention was protecting the ones who wore those white sheets at night and burned crosses and planted devices that would unalive little black girls, and then be welcome into the white man's church on Sunday morning. I couldn't help but think about how I did not seek ordination within evangelical Christianity because I already understood that my work, my convictions, my advocacy, and my questions would not fit safely within those structures. I needed a spiritual framework expansive enough to hold truth-telling, grief, justice, curiosity, humanity, and sacred care without demanding conformity. Now, please do not think for a second that I am comparing the droplet of water that represents my activism to Dr. King's massive tsunami of advocacy. But his sermon validated for me that non-conforming from Christian patriarchy is often the way of sacred activism. And right there before me, a man who had been assassinated when I was 7 years old was speaking to me. And what I find meaningful now is that Dr. King's sermon reframed nonconformity for me. In many Christian spaces, nonconformity is often portrayed as rebellion against God. But Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. presented constructive nonconformity as moral courage. The willingness to stand apart from the crowd when the crowd is wrong, the willingness to refuse systems that harm people, the willingness to prioritize conscience over belonging. That understanding helped me realize that leaving institutional Christianity was not abandoning my integrity. In many ways, it was an attempt to preserve it. That is also part of why I still use the title Reverend, not because I am clinging to the church I left, but because reverence, advocacy, spiritual care, and moral courage still matter deeply to me. My understanding of spirituality expanded beyond Christianity, but it did not disappear. If anything, it became more honest, more compassionate, and more rooted in humanity than ever before. And although I would eventually untether completely from my Christian heritage, Dr. King's sermon sustained me for many years, providing me an anchor as Christian nationalism became louder and more dangerous. If someone were to ask me if I feel as if I abandoned Christian leaders like Dr. King by leaving Christianity, I would answer absolutely not. Because in 1954, Dr. King called for nonconforming Christians because for far too long, quote, the church has too often been an institution serving to crystallize and conserve the patterns of the crowd, end quote. That sermon would have been seen as radical, even outrageous to some. No one questioned church leadership and structure, but Dr. King was literally doing that, imploring the Christian to look beyond their indoctrination that kept them obedient and tragically silent to the injustices happening in America in the 50s. But the church now, it has invited fascism to the pulpit and voted it into the Oval Office. And it isn't enough to ask Christians to be nonconforming. I'm certain that the wayshowers from the civil rights era would be screaming for nonconformity in radical ways. And it may not look like leaving Christianity entirely for everyone, but for me, it was the right decision. And finding that sermon not only affirmed me, it saved me. So I say thank you to Dr. King. One of the most important parts of deconstructing is understanding that leaving Christianity does not automatically mean abandoning spirituality, meaning, ethics, or sacred connection. For some people it does, and that path deserves respect. For others, deconstructing becomes a rebuilding process where spirituality expands beyond the confines of dogma and control. Some people become chaplains, some embrace contemplative practices, some move into interfaith work. Some reconnect with mysticism, nature, humanity, justice, or compassion as sacred experiences. There is no single correct destination after deconstructing. I think many people are still untangling that assumption that leaving Christianity must result in either atheism or returning to church. Human spiritual experience is far more layered than that. Advocacy has become one of the clearest expressions of reverence in my life. Walking alongside people harmed by religion, creating space for the unchurched, helping people untangle shame, fear, indoctrination, and spiritual abuse, holding space for grief, doubt, anger, educating people on how Christian patriarchy has benefited the white Christian to the point that apathy, white saviorism, and everything in between are possible reactions to the call for social justice. That work feels deeply sacred to me. It may not resemble the version of ministry many people were taught to recognize, but sacred care has always existed outside church walls, and many traditions throughout history have understood that. I also think this conversation reveals how deeply Christianity often centers itself as the default lens through which all spirituality is interpreted, and that is incorrect. Many of us were not taught to respect or even meaningfully understand spiritual traditions outside of Christianity. But interfaith, interspiritual work, it requires humility. It asks us to recognize that other cultures, traditions, and spiritual paths have their own understandings of sacred leadership, reverence, ritual, service, and meaning. And part of my journey has been learning to respect those traditions rather than just assuming Christianity defines the boundaries of what spirituality can be. But at the end of the day, I do not use the title Reverend because I'm trying to recreate the church I left. I use it because it honestly reflects the life I live and the work I do. My path no longer fits neatly inside institutional Christianity, but it is still rooted in compassion, care, advocacy, reflection, and reverence for human life. For me, that is sacred work. Now, to finally answer your question, I'm going to remain a reverend because I live my vows to be a goddess of kindness and a warrior for justice. That, to me, is a reverent life. Leaving Christianity didn't lessen my commitment to my vows. It empowered me. I hope I answered your question. You can find this writing on Substack, and things are weird here in social media, so please follow me on all my channels so we can stay connected.